Good evening. Good evening to everyone. Normally this is done on Saturday. This is done on Friday afternoon. This is the 18th of the Dr. Oba T'Shaka shows. And this is going to be an interview and conversation with Professor Dr. Baba Zak Kondo on his book, Conspiracy: Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X. And I wanted to have Brother Kondo on because he is the foremost authority on Malcolm, and you're going to get the best stuff, particularly on Malcolm's assassination. He's the foremost authority on it, and I think you're going to benefit from this discussion. Um, I met Dr. Professor Baba Zak Kondo um, as he was working on his book, and I had the pleasure to read a draft of his book. And I saw that this was an outstanding piece of work and a great deal of research, but a work is only as good as the consciousness of the writer as well as the work that they do in terms of research. So, Brother Zak, it's a pleasure to have you. How you
The
doing?
pleasure, the pleasure is mine, Baba. Also, when I was doing my research, your book on the political legacy of Malcolm was important to my work as far as putting information in context. I don't know if I've ever had a chance to say that to you, but I did want to say that to you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, thank you, and thank you, because yours is a monumental work. In fact, scholars in the field acknowledge that Baba Zak Kondo's work on the assassination of Malcolm X is the best work. And people who have done research in the field acknowledge that and have written, um, including the author of The Judas Factor, which is itself a good work. He acknowledges that yours is premier. Could you give people a little background on yourself?
Oh, sure. Um, I'm from Virginia. Um, uh, Went through the public schools of Newport News, Virginia. Anybody familiar with Newport News? It's on the peninsula. It's a peninsula near like Williamsburg. Most people know Williamsburg. It's between Williamsburg and Norfolk. Just to give you a general idea. When I was in the seventh grade, we were bused, and we were. I came from an all African neighborhood. We were bused to an all white school. And that was a year that I found the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I read it. So I was 12 years old. I was in the seventh grade, and it basically changed my life. Um, I've talked about this a lot, but uh, I was one of those young brothers who generally, when it was time to do a book report, I'd find the thinnest book I could find in the library. And here I am. I was on the Fort Eustis base. Where I lived, it was most of the older people were military, and so I was at Fort Eustis, and I was waiting for the bus, and I went into the library, which is right across the street from the bus stop, and just browsing, just chilling, and I came across this book, the autobiography of Malcolm X. It had Malcolm X on it, speaking. It was a real big, thick book, like 300 something pages, and he was. I had heard the name Malcolm a few years before, but didn't know nothing about him really. And I picked up the book and I started reading it while I was waiting for the bus, and ended up missing about 2 or 3 buses, and then did the unspeakable. I checked out this big thick book, and I didn't put it down. I think for the next couple of weeks, I read it twice. Then I later rechecked it out and read it a third time. And what it did was it just opened up a new universe for me. Um, and it also introduced me to other people like Marcus Garvey, J.A. Rogers, whoever Malcolm mentioned in the book. I would find that person too. And then within the next few years, I read every book that had been published on Malcolm that I could get my hands on. And from that period forward, as my family would say, I've been into that black stuff, that African stuff, and it has helped to define, who I am. My consciousness began to grow, and it continues to grow. But that was the catalyst. It introduced me to the Black Panthers, and I read, I read goo gobs of people after I was introduced to Malcolm X, and got in trouble too. I will never forget. I was suspended one time from that school, and my parents had to bring me back. So my mother brought me back, and I never forget this. We're in this meeting, so that I could be readmitted to school, and this white teacher, redneck white teacher, who had been discriminating against us since we got there. She's talking to my mother, and she says, by the by, in case you didn't know, she said, talking about me, he's been reading Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. And I really think you and your husband need to, watch what he reads. So, so here's a white teacher, a redneck, racist white teacher, been discriminating against us since we've been there. And I never forget, my mother looks her in the eye and she said, as a teacher, I would think that you would appreciate the fact that the boy reads.
Mhm.
No, we're not going to censor what he reads. We like the fact this boy's reading college books. We like that. So no, thank you. We will not censor. I remember that because it gave more validation to what I was doing.
Mhm. How old were you when you read the autobiography of Malcolm X?
I was 12.
Wow. Mhm.
Yeah. In fact, I just turned 12 actually. Um, and yeah, so people react to different things, different stimuli. But for me, it was that. And then that was the beginning of a process that I've never left.
Yeah.
So that kind of set my course in this life, in this world, as Fanon would say, it helped to define my mission. And I've been there ever since.
Yeah, you're quite fortunate to have had that exposure at that young age. And then coming out of an African community, you had other things to give you backup, but that's quite an important thing. I wear a goatee because Malcolm wore one, and he's my second master. Garvey was my first, as you might have gathered from the legacy of Malcolm X.
Sure.
And Malcolm was the second. I had already undergone an awakening that paralleled Malcolm's, and only knew that after the autobiography came out, because mine occurred in '63, and the autobiography came out after Malcolm's assassination. So that's very important, because it means that your work has special meaning, in terms not only on Malcolm, but the consciousness that was developed out of that and other life experiences would lend a lot to your work, So
Yeah.
yeah, interesting. And no telling how many millions of Black folks he affected, and not just in this country. I was in Tanzania working in the Ujamaa villages in 1973, and I'm on a train, and this young Tanzanian is telling me about Malcolm, and he was as energetic as we are. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he had an in-depth understanding. What's your thought on the fact that, because in fact, when I wrote the political legacy of Malcolm X, I knew that there were missing chapters then. And that was, the book came out in 1984. So I knew it earlier than that. So what's your view of that in relationship to the autobiography of Malcolm X, the fact that there were missing chapters,
Right.
and what's the implication of that?
Yeah. Um, this is the way I look at the whole, you know, really Alex Haley, because that's really what we're really talking about here is Alex Haley. What I had to learn to do is the autobiography, very important book for me and for millions of other African people, like you just said. But we also have to be able to put it in context. And when we put it in context, we have to also accept the fact that the autobiography was not written by Malcolm X. It was written by Alex Haley. And unfortunately, and this is the part that I think a lot of us need to just be reminded of. Malcolm never read the autobiography of Malcolm X in its entirety. He went through a draft and he started marking it up. And Alex Haley didn't like that because his concern was that Malcolm was going to turn the autobiography into a weapon against Elijah Muhammad. Alex Haley's thing was he wanted to keep the original authenticity of it, in which Malcolm was basically, still in the nation and still basically worshiping Elijah Muhammad. And so what I think ended up happening is Alex Haley began to substitute his own, perspective, his own, I guess you could say Malcolm's lens, if you will, in place of Malcolm's. And I think that that's something that we need to be critical of as serious-minded African people. So in other words, my point is that the autobiography has its problems, mostly because of Alex Haley. It's unfortunate, that Malcolm could not have written his own autobiography without a filter. But unfortunately, we have to take the filter, we have to take the autobiography with the good and the bad. And so my thing is, as long as we know that, as long as we know that the autobiography is not the final word on Malcolm X from Malcolm X's standpoint, as long as we know that Alex Haley is the filter, he's in between all of that. He's tainting it in some ways. Because one thing that I do agree with I guess it was I want to say it was Marable. I think it was Marable, but the point that they were making is that when we look at the autobiography of Malcolm X, we need to be sensitive as to, what was, like, in other words, if you don't trust Alex Haley, which, by the way, I really don't. I had the opportunity to interview Alex Haley when I was doing my research. And I don't know, I think Alex Haley wanted to promote similar to Manny Marable, actually. He wanted to promote a certain sort of image of Malcolm. And that was the Malcolm who was into, who was an integrationist, a Malcolm who was trying to find his place in the civil rights movement, a Malcolm who was probably less sure of himself than he actually was. And I think that's Alex Haley. So my thing is, you got to make a distinction between the spirit of Malcolm X that comes out of the autobiography and sometimes the authenticity of it that I think, is tainted by Alex Haley.
Yeah, because Alex Haley was a good writer, and he also wanted to do the human interest angle, but he was not political.
No.
And so to even interpret Malcolm would be hard for him to do. And I think, the integrationist thing, you're referring to the Mecca and all of that he made more of than was real.
Yeah.
Putting Malcolm in context, what do you see as some of the major points that are important about Malcolm's contribution to history, his importance, both to African-American history, world history, African history globally, and people around the world? What do you see as the significance of Malcolm and his legacy?
Well, I think Malcolm's legacy has a lot of layers. a lot of layers to it. Let's start with the international. You know, I find it interesting that even today, you know, getting, you know, close to, you know, what is it? Let's see. Malcolm's killed 65, 35. Like, we're getting close to 60 years since Malcolm's assassination. And it amazes me how much Malcolm continues to affect and to impact people in the United States, in Canada, on the continent, in the Caribbean, even in Europe at this late date. And I think that to me is a tribute, you know, to several things. A, his analytical skills. You know, Malcolm was one of the sharpest people of his day. One of the things that I always studied Malcolm for was how Malcolm basically was able to train his mind. You know, he was self-educated. He taught himself, which I think is the best tool anyway. I'm reminded of something that Queen Mother Moore used to say. You know, you remember Queen Mother Moore quit school in the 3rd grade, and she's always joked that she still stayed in school too long to learn anything. And I think that in Malcolm's case, you know, you have somebody who, you know, basically dropped out in the 9th grade, but then educated himself, picked up the ball himself. And in the process, he developed a mind that was disciplined, you know, a mind that could absorb information very quickly and process it very quickly. So first and foremost, I think Malcolm's analytical skills, you know, like when you saw Malcolm in interviews in this country, and he, you know, and often, or when he was debating somebody, because normally they would try to pit him up against either some white you know, some white person, or oftentimes a Negro. And basically Malcolm generally ate them all for lunch because his mind was so disciplined. And so I've used Malcolm, you know, for my own, you know, mindset, you know, because the mind is like a muscle. And I think Malcolm knew that. And he knew that one of the greatest weapons that he could ever use against our enemies was this right here. So I think that's one of the things that people admire about Malcolm, because they listen to his speeches. They listen to the interviews. They see how sharp, how, you know, how quick his wit was. And I think that that's one of the major, you know, attributes that separates Malcolm. But also, I think the politics of Malcolm. Remember this, Malcolm was saying things, you know, in the 60s, actually in the late 50s and into the 60s until his assassination. He was saying things that the average brother or sister, the perspective of it, the analysis of it, they hadn't thought about it. They hadn't went there, you know. And in fact, I would suggest to you that in 1965 and before, I can't think of one person who, from a thinking standpoint and a political standpoint, that I think was on the same level as Malcolm. You know, I respect Martin Luther King, but I don't think King had even the analytical analysis, you know, capability that Malcolm X had. And I don't care about degrees and all that stuff. That's irrelevant. Malcolm, to me, was in a class all by himself. And then, of course, the other thing that I think separates Malcolm was his critiques. Remember, Malcolm gave critiques of the United States during the, you know, and we're in the midst of the Cold War. He was giving critiques, you know, that superseded what Russia was trying to say, superseded what China was, you know, was trying to say. The Steel Curtain and all those countries that were critical of the United States. Malcolm penetrated them more deeply than any of those countries, because he had that perception, he had that sensitivity, and I think that's something else that separates Malcolm, from everybody else. And then the final thing that I'll say on this is that nobody gave the critical analysis of the United States more thoroughly than Malcolm X. The hypocrisy, for example, because remember, the United States then and now is trying to masquerade around the world as being, a believer in justice and all that stuff. Malcolm destroyed all of that. He could see the hypocrisy, and more importantly, he was willing to talk about the hypocrisy. So I just think just things like that, it just separated Malcolm from all of the other, leaders of the era, all of the other activists of the era. He was just, to me, he was in a class by himself.
Well put. I would add that what really made much of this disciplined mind and this analytical ability, aside from his own natural brilliance, was the awakening process that he went through in prison. And he often described it this way. He said, first your philosophy changes, then your attitude pattern changes, then your thought pattern changes, communication pattern changes, and behavior pattern changes. And you could take a picture of Malcolm when he was on the streets, and he looked like he was in that life, someone you wouldn't trust at a certain point. And you could look at Malcolm when he underwent transformation in stages. When he first goes into the nation, he almost looks like a monk. I mean, somebody who's just dealing with the necessary essentials. His whole concern is on his mission, you know what I mean? But there was a transformation process that he underwent. And personally, I think that he wasn't conscious of this. It put him on a collision course with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, because the messenger had a transformation that he contributed to Malcolm, which was religious, spiritual. But Malcolm had a political, a historical, a social, an economic, a philosophical, and most people don't note it until his family started writing about him, the seventh child, that the books that he read in prison that were relevant came from his family, Black books. The other books were the prison library. So that conversion, that transformation, I think was key. And I think that leaders that underwent that transformation, or members in the Black liberation movement, had much more to contribute than those that didn't,
Yeah.
I have a picture behind me of Amilcar Cabral. He underwent that same transformation, and they both came out of the assimilated mindset, and in Malcolm's so-called criminal, in the beginning. So those are perceptive observations you got, because that mind of his, John Henry Clark would say, he was the most brilliant mind that we produced in the 20th century. I would say the most brilliant political mind, without a doubt. And he could beat people in a debate without debating them.
Yeah. I mean, he was special. It was remarkable, I think, just to kind of watch Malcolm. And the thing that we want to be careful is that it's easy, I think, to become infatuated with Malcolm's personality. But I think that, to me, it wasn't the personality. It wasn't the charisma and all those things that, many of us get caught up on. It's when you hear this man say what he say, and you analyze what he say, and you put it under a microscope, you say, damn, why didn't I think of that? And I think that's what, one of the criteria that I've always used, as a African, race man, as an African revolutionary, is I've always been fascinated by people who say things, and I ask myself the question, why didn't I think of that? That tells me that's like the ultimate of, the ultimate analysis when I can say about somebody, God, why didn't I think of that? And I say that for Malcolm on so many levels, starting as a child, but even as a grown up, you know, and that's always served as a litmus test for me of just how special, you know, Malcolm X is. It's like when I read Enemies for the first time by Haki Madhubuti, and I'm reading and I'm saying to myself, damn, what an analysis. Why didn't I think of that? Why couldn't I see that? Or when I was reading Vincent Harding, There's a River, you know, it's like, wow, why didn't I look at that like that? And so with Malcolm, it was just so many of those. And so in so many ways, you know, he taught me, you know, as a young person, and even as I got old, it was like, you know, this was one of my teachers, because it's like I'm reading what this guy is saying in a speech, or, you know, sometimes in autobiography, and I'm saying to myself, wow, I wish I would have thought of that. But it's forcing me to another level of analysis, another level of consciousness. And you can't duplicate that. You know, you can't say that about a lot of people. Yeah, but right. I consistently used to say that about Malcolm. Wow, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, he was original, creative and original, and thought outside the box and boundaries set by this country. John Henry Clark, who was an advisor to him, he gave one example. He said Malcolm called him a number of times because he was an advisor on African issues and stuff. And so he had a debate with some foremost scholars on the Congo and colonialism in the Congo and whatnot. And so he called John because he knew that he needed more information. John gave him basically the soliloquy on the Congo, the work by Mark Twain, and some other stuff. He said Malcolm read that in a few minutes, went on and cleaned the clock of the so-called experts on the Congo. But he was an in-depth reader. But in this particular case, you know, when he had to brief himself quick, he was able to absorb information. He had enough other information to just knock his opponents out. You know what I mean? And, yeah. You know, another quality of him is, as brilliant as he was, he also drew on people that had good ideas, because the organization Afro-American Unity, he had some brilliant African-American scholars shaping his, you know, platform and other stuff. So brilliant as he was constant. And key thing is, he was a reader. He read all the time. And he was reading stuff some of us still haven't read. There's a book by Lerone Bennett, Negro Mood, later called Black Mood. You heard of that book?
Yeah, I used to love some Lerone Bennett. In fact, I used one of his books when I was at Bowie for a couple semesters. I think it was Black Power USA. And I think I also used Before the Mayflower. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. This is a conversation. You're going to be doing the depth on the assassination, not me. But this is a conversation. I was in Selma in 65, and it was the end of my period in the so-called civil rights movement. We had just cleaned clocks in the San Francisco Freedom Movement, and I was March Marshal, and so Bennett was there, and Bennett would come to our national convention. So, and I was also at the Million Man March, and Bennett was up on the stage, and so I asked him a question. I knew his answer. What's your best book? I knew what he would say. Negro Mood. It's only about 120 pages. Malcolm had read that. I remember seeing in one of the Socialist Workers' Party publications, Malcolm holding the book, and I looked at, what was the title? Negro Mood. 2 chapters in there, The Black Establishment and Voices from the Cave. And that made that book a classic. But Malcolm was reading and digging all the time. He didn't have much time to sleep. I think it was 4 hours. You know what I mean? So yeah, amazing. I mean, amazing. And you're right, not to get caught up in the personality or idolize the personality. He's a human being.
Right.
You know? And I'm sure we'll get into some of his human traits and human qualities. I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but Manning Marble, in his book on Malcolm, he characterized, his book was on the reinvention of Malcolm. He characterized Malcolm as basically someone who was reinventing himself in a way to mean falsely. So what's your view of that?
Yeah. I think that many Marables made the same mistake that Alex Haley made with Malcolm. It's like they want to portray Malcolm in a way that supports and validates their particular perspective when it comes to race, when it comes to struggle, when it comes to, even American society. So, I understood what Marable was trying to say because, his whole thing too was that, Malcolm was in a transformation, and at the time of his assassination, well, Malcolm told you that, he was working on, some new directions anyway. But everything we know about Malcolm says that the direction, was going to be toward Black nationalism, toward Pan-Africanism. He wasn't headed toward, we shall overcome and let's lock arms. Mm-hmm. But I think that's what the many Marables, I think that's what the Alex Haley's, that's what they want for Malcolm. And then any little bit, that he might have said something here, kind of like what Brightman them did with the socialist, with the Socialist Workers Party, the militant, anytime Malcolm said something about capitalism or said something about greed or something like that, then they use that as evidence that Malcolm was evolving into a socialist. Mm-hmm. And I think that basically Haley would kind of like do the same thing. And what they wanted to see, of Malcolm was that Malcolm was going to go more toward integrationism, assimilationism, and, let's all be American and all that type of stuff. But, there's nothing substantive in Malcolm that supported that. But I think, Malcolm is one of those few people that many people want him to be, they want to identify with him. And so they want him to be, molded in a way that they can support him. Mm-hmm. So for Malcolm, it's that integrationist stuff. He wanted Black people, white people to, lock arms and see we should overcome. But that's not Malcolm. It's okay for King, but that's not Malcolm X. But I think that's what Haley and your boy, Marable, I think that's kind of like where they were going with that.
Yeah, Marable would take some exaggerations of Malcolm, like his exaggeration of his criminal life, to then use this, or failing to tell certain things about what happened when he was arrested for burglary and his role in other people being arrested, to then paint a broad brush to say he was reinventing himself, when in fact, Malcolm was a revolutionary in the nation and outside, but he was growing. He was transforming. Reinventing nothing was transformation, real radical transformation,
Exactly.
Yeah. You did consulting work on the film on Malcolm X that Spike Lee did. Describe that and your view on the film itself.
Well, I mean, I think the film, was a Hollywood production. And I think whenever you're dealing with Hollywood, it will not be authentic, or it will not be authentic enough. In film school, they teach film students to be what they call, to practice economy. Instead of introducing a whole bunch of actors, for different scenes, get one person doing multiple, things that other people did. That way, you don't have to introduce a new character for your, viewer to be confused by. And if you look at that particular film, like one of the things that Spike did is he had one character in the film who in real life, he did things that in real life, 5 different characters or people did. And so, when you bring in those types of, because people like me, I don't care about Hollywood. I don't care about films. All I'm looking for is to present an accurate portrait of the person that just supposed to be a biop. So just do that. And if you can't do that, then to me, it's not going to be authentic. It's not going to be, it's entertainment, but it's not entertainment. And I think that the role of, if you're going to do a biop, now it's different if you're doing a film, a drama, and, a thriller and all those things, that's different. But if you're going to do a biop, then you need to be accurate in your thing. And you can't bring in stuff, to me, that's not accurate, even with the characters and stuff. So, that's my problem. And, if we want, why don't we use this as a segue for the Malcolm X, for that Netflix thing, because I know we said we want to talk about that. And to me, it's kind of similar. As far as accuracy is concerned, because I just think that the way that Netflix thing was done, it's kind of interesting. It took me a while once I saw it. I saw it one time and then I could only see it one more time. But when I saw it the second time, I realized what they did with the Netflix thing. If you look at some of Gates's films, he's kind of like this unassuming, non-threatening, don't have to take too serious narrator. He's vulnerable. He might snap a joke here and there as a narrator, but you feel comfortable listening to him as he narrates because you're not taking him too serious. And I think that was the role that Muhammad played in the Netflix thing. He was basically Gates. And in fact, his energy was like Gates. And I think that what they were basically trying to do is they tried to, present Malcolm. They falsely put out a narrative that said that everybody thought that Butler and Johnson, were guilty, and that everybody thought, that the right men were in prison for Malcolm's assassination, and everybody thought that Newark didn't have anything to do with it. And so basically stuff that was already out there through research by people like me and you, we'd already put this stuff out there. And so by them portraying this as if this is something new, so Muhammad is coming with something different. He's coming with something new. And therefore, it's going to turn everything upside down on what we know about Malcolm X. When in fact, all Muhammad did was just reiterated what we had long put out there. And in fact, as I was telling you when we were talking earlier, as I analyzed that film for the second time, it was real clear to me that there was actually nothing of substance that was in that film that I had not already covered it or some other researcher had not covered it. And when I say nothing, I mean absolutely nothing. So the problem with that film, and I'm reminded of an African proverb that basically goes, to he who does not know, a garden is a forest. And I think that the problem with that film is that it presupposed that these were the standard beliefs that a lot of people have. And so anything that they do that's different from that is a major contribution. Is, they are redefining and uncovering new information. And so the problem with that film is that it's misleading to start, but also, you know, it's like they have overblown its overall contribution. It's nothing new there. And when I say nothing new, I really mean that there's nothing new, you know, and you know, even him talking about the killers, you know, there were, you know, first you got to deal with Hare talked about the killers in his affidavit in 1977. Tony Brown talked about the killers when he interviewed Hare. In 1979, Peter Goldman did added an afterthought chapter in which he interviewed Hare in prison, and so they dealt with the killer. So my point is that this is the historical reality. But when you watch that film, you get the impression that none of this ever happened, but that Muhammad was, you know, thought that something was wrong, and then he took it upon himself to go, and then he uncovered information about the true killers. Absurd.
And, you know, basically, Skip Gates knew what he was doing, that his thing was to not really rely on serious scholarship. You should have been a central person, and is it Paul Lee?
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul Lee, but you especially should have been the central person on this, since your work is definitive, but you were kind of put to the sideline, and the person who's talking has no real substance, you know, and has nothing that he's contributed to the field at all. I was having trouble staying awake. I watched it, but it was like in my days, I got the message, you know what I mean?
Right.
I didn't know that it was Skip Gates that had produced it. Maybe I started after it started.
Right. And see, I didn't know that either. I found out that it was Skip Gates after they filmed me for the last time, because if I would have known that in advance, I would not have participated. And let me make one other point that I also want to make sure that I make. You were talking about how, when it came to me, how the film dealt with me. You know, I thought about this once I saw it the second time, and I understood their dilemma. See, they had a problem with me in this film, and this was the dilemma. They needed my scholarship, you know, and of course, Muhammad's so-called scholarship is based on my scholarship, which he used to always tell me how my book was the gold standard, and but for my book, blah, blah, blah. Of course, none of that comes out in the film, but this was the dilemma that they had. They had already decided that the narrative was going to be that Muhammad was a lone ranger, that he took it upon himself to uncover the truth about Malcolm's assassination. So that automatically meant that even though they could use my scholarship, they could not identify me and my book, because they had to choose between, you know, in other words, if my book exists and they acknowledge the existence of my book, and the information that's in my book is the information, you know, that this guy is talking about, I'm talking about Muhammad is talking about in his narrative, then that would have destroyed their narrative, because their thing was Muhammad came across this stuff. He uncovered this information. You don't have the thesis of their particular, you know, narrative is exploded if Zak Kondo did that 20 something years before in his book. Then it would destroy Muhammad as this lone crusader uncovering the truth that nobody else had been able to uncover. So they had to, so that's why they can't identify me in the film as an author. They can't identify the name of my book, nor can they say anything really about my scholarship in general. Because if you identify me, then you don't have the narrative with him. That narrative is shot. So I basically would have to be used by research with me in it, but I then become invisible. So basically, I'm in the film, but I am invisible as far as who I am. Like, you watch that and you don't know nothing about me as a scholar. You don't know nothing about my work in Malcolm X, because all of that would have undermined what their thesis was and their narrative was for Muhammad.
Yeah, now that's well put, because Muhammad is portrayed as this guy. I think he was doing his little work on the little bus that he worked on, whatever, and he's somebody who's done all this digging. He hasn't written anything. There's no evidence of anything that he's uncovered that's serious, but that is the Harvard Project. The Harvard Project is to pretty much cover our history and obliterate it. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
Because as we're building African-centered studies, Black
Right.
studies, it's radical and militant, then they have what they call the dream team over at Harvard. And I have no objection if, even though it's at Harvard and they brainwash you at Harvard real well, but if you got some good scholars there, no problem. Is this W.B. Du Bois? Definitely no problem. But here's somebody who comes along that doesn't even have the courage to put his department on an independent basis. He's subordinate at Harvard and is being used as an attack dog against Afrocentricity. When Leonard Jeffries was putting down a strong position, City College in New York, he's being attacked by Harvard. When they're trying to destroy Black studies at San Francisco State, I'm leading the fight against it. Here comes Skip Gates out to have dinner with the president. And what does he say? He never heard of Black studies at San Francisco State. We gave birth to Black studies at four-year universities, and Merritt did through the Black Panthers first at a two-year college. You know what I mean? You never heard of either one of those, huh? You know, so yeah, there's a deliberate effort to bury you because it's a radical voice. And this thing that he's done recently on the Black church, it looks good on the surface. But if you go underneath it, what he's done is, while there's some interesting timelines, and the last show is dealing with the hip hop generation, their alienation from the church and blah, blah. And he's got the minister for Barack Obama, Jeremiah Wright, speaking. He's a good brother. But what he buries in that show, when he looks at the Black church, is the African basis for African-American spirituality, which is the basis for the real Black church. It's buried, it's lost, you know? So on the surface, there's a lot of stuff that good to know, a lot of good singing and different things, a lot of visuals, but underneath, he's whitewashed your history. You don't know it.
Right.
You know what I mean? So yeah.
Right. And I think historically, I think that has been the role that he has played. And I think technically that's the role that Harvard's Black studies basically plays. I mean, if we're being serious.
Yeah.
Because he's not there to empower African people. He's not there to liberate African people. That's not what the Gates mission is. His mission is just to integrate us into, white America and get that white American validation and stuff. But he ain't about African people.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, we don't have to, blow it out of proportion. But I think, to go back to what I said earlier, I don't know if I said it for the camera or if just me and you were talking, but I was making a point that when I was doing consultant work with Black Side during the early 1990s, at that stage of the game, and I had to go to Boston, to the Cambridge area, every last person who was in Harvard's Black Studies program married white, every last one of them. So for someone like me, and you, that says a whole lot about the personhood of the person who's hiring them, because we know Gates was hiring them. So what does that say? What does that tell you about his mentality, but also about the mentality of the faculty there? And yet we're supposed to give them validation because they're Harvard. Like, Harvard has done something for African people historically. So we're supposed to validate Harvard or some of those other places? Really?
Yeah.
Right.
Or someone that puts down the Black arts movement. You know what I mean? talking about it, it really doesn't have any real validity. I mean, you know, some of our best artists who were not in the Black arts movement were shaped by it
Yeah.
and say so. But a real independent arts movement financed by, organized by Black folks, not by foundations or anything else, and produces a Sonia Sanchez and a Miri Baraka, Skia Muhammad Toure, and a host of others. And then, you know, the more prominent public poets and artists who acknowledge that a lot of their work was inspired by that. You know what I mean? And he's going to put that down? You know, now, in the Judas Factor, Evans makes note of something that I thought was important. He noted Malcolm's connection to Paul Robeson, you know, in prison. And I noted your reflections on him in your book. What do you see as Paul Robeson's impact on Malcolm's thinking?
Yeah, I think what's significant when you look at the evolution of Malcolm's thinking is that think about who was Malcolm drawn to the most. Malcolm was drawn to those Africans who were A, to the left, B, these were basically warriors that white people labeled in a negative way. That's who Malcolm was drawn to. That's why it's no accident that his family and Malcolm himself had appreciation for Marcus Garvey. You know, there were other people that he could have been drawn to that he wasn't. He was drawn to those brothers and sisters who were trying to shake things up. Now we can debate, different levels when it comes to, Du Bois. Du Bois was complex. Like when you study, his conflict with Garvey and some of the sabotage and some of that stuff. We need to talk about accountability and stuff. But even with someone like Du Bois, it was always somebody to the left. So my point is that Malcolm was always drawn to those brothers and sisters who were shaking things up that will ultimately be him. In other words, he's drawn to people who will basically, the same footsteps that he will walk into are the people that Malcolm was most drawn to, and therefore someone like a Paul Robeson, someone like a Garvey, someone like a Hubert Harrison and people like that. Those are the people that's going to get Malcolm's attention. People, in Harlem, the people who just pull up, what do they call them? Those, the preachers with when they bring their own little, platform.
Right.
I can't think of it, but those are the people who caught Malcolm's attention because those people were talking about things that the average brother and sister was not gonna talk about.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think that's real important because we're going to get into the Nation of Islam and Malcolm, but the fact that Robeson was opposed to the Korean War. Malcolm was the first, as you pointed out in your book, to oppose the war in Vietnam, major leader. Robeson was about bringing the U.S. before the UN.
The UN, yeah, exactly.
Violations on genocide. And when Malcolm would take his position on human rights, he'd often slip and say genocide.
Exactly.
Like dipping
exactly.
into Robeson's bag. And then Malcolm got a lot of his stuff on animal analogies, partially from Michaud's bookstore, but also from Paul Robeson. You know what I mean? And so, but I think there's a kinship, as you say, to the left. He's drawn to radicals.
Yeah.
And, you can't get much more radical, manly, or bad than Paul Robeson. And he said he was one of his greatest, if not his greatest hero. And he only got to meet him once, just briefly. You know what I mean? So that's often ignored that black Superman called Paul Robeson. I mean, there was a Superman. That was one, you know what I mean? A
Right.
man of integrity. And he had that, you know what I mean? He had that. Now, Elijah Muhammad, as Malcolm's in prison, and he's starting to undergo a transformation. Um, you know, his family is in the nation and so forth. What do you see as the value that Malcolm saw in Elijah, and what attracted him to Elijah and the nation?
Yeah. Well, first I would start with the earlier analysis. The Nation of Islam was also to the left, and I'm not talking about from a standpoint of capitalism versus socialism, that type of stuff, but they were to the left. They were not mainstream from a religious standpoint within our community. So I think that was the first draw. I think I think some of the other draws is that the nation came forth with a racial platform. And I think Malcolm was at a stage then in which the whole racialism, you know, of reality was smacking him in the face. And so a lot of Muhammadan came forward and they talked about, you know, uh, you know, about they had a origin story that had black versus white, and white, being, in a negative light. That was something very unusual. I think Malcolm was drawn to that type of assessment as well. But I think once you get past that, I think Malcolm, found in Elijah Muhammad the father that he was robbed of. And I think that it's easy to underestimate that, the relationship, the sociological relationship part that kind of brought Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad together. Malcolm needed that paternalism because think about it, in his lifetime, he really didn't know it. He grew up without having that strong African, male energy. And I think Elijah Muhammad fit, his, you know, it fit the mold for Malcolm and stuff. So I think that, that was a major draw for Malcolm. I think the other thing that was important that the nation presented is that, it was basically African people. Because think about it, Malcolm had spent his lifetime seldom seeing African people in positions of strength. And yet within the Nation of Islam, he sees this organized structure. He sees respect within the community, like, amongst African people. He sees this image, this strong positive image that he hadn't seen very much on the streets. And I think that that was also a draw. And of course, it certainly helped that his family, like all of them, like his whole damn family had pretty much fell under the spell as well. And I think that was a certain level of validation. I think that a Malcolm, that was important to Malcolm at that time too. Because remember, it was all of his brothers, all his siblings had basically, drank the Kool-Aid. And I think that was important for Malcolm, during that time in his life. Of course, as time goes on, it's gonna, get a little bit rocky, and there's gonna be negative energy, and there's gonna be a split and all that within the family. But I think all of these things made the nation, and then finally, it gave Malcolm direction. Because see, I think Malcolm was a brother who constantly was looking for direction. I think the whole gangster life, was him looking for direction. Him being, in and out of trouble was looking for direction. Even when he was in prison, trying to decide which corner he was going to turn, deciding that he was going to teach himself, how to read and write, and to read a whole lot of serious books. I think all of that was Malcolm's way of saying, I'm looking for direction. And I think, the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad pretty much, checked off all those boxes at that stage of Malcolm's life. He's going to be coming out of prison soon. Where do you go from here? And I think that he ultimately found that there was a deeper meaning in his life, beyond just being a gangster, or another statistic. And I think the Nation of Islam was able to, to fill that void. And it was a very important void for Malcolm.
Yeah, those are good insights. One thing I like about your writing style is you're very concise and you pull together a lot of details. Boom, 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 boom. And we're going to come back into the boom, boom in a minute. I just want to riff off of a few of your points. The father figure. I think that there's no way to underestimate that. And one of the things I note in my book is that to understand Malcolm is to understand that family was his foundation. It's really his foundation. It isn't for everybody. It's not for me. I'm a world person. My brother was a family man. He remembered everything about the family, everything seen through the family. And if you look at Malcolm, who recruits him into the Nation of Islam? It's his family. You know what I mean? And as you say, Elijah Muhammad was a father figure for him, and real, because he was a corporal in the Garvey movement, his father and mother both playing a major role in the Garvey movement. And at every shift, when he's in the streets, that's family. Shorty is family, comes from the same area. You know what I mean?
Right.
So yeah, family's fundamental to him. And even when you get into the hard periods that he goes through with the nation, being separated from family was rough on him. I mean, that was rough on him. The other thing about, your point about strength, that he saw strength, and he was to the left. The nation was in rebellion against the standard definitions that the society provides for Blacks. Even when he was in the streets, he was in a form of rebellion that was confused, but it was rebellion.
Yeah, it was. And that's a good point. Because technically, what are they? They're exploiters. They're trying to exploit a system, that's not working for them. So how do you make this system work for you?
Right.
You do the underhanded stuff. You do the, what's the word that they like to use? The underground stuff. But that's an exploitation of the system.
Mm-hmm. And hustling, because the way he described it in the autobiography, there was the art of hustling, and he may have exaggerated some stuff, but he's talking about guys who had games and stuff like that. So now when he wakes up, then it's beyond gaming. He's into really using this stuff, but it was a form of gaming. He was using his mind in a certain way. It wasn't where it should have been, and some revealing stuff too, that when he's in the streets, he also would occasionally talk about Marcus Garvey. So it wasn't like his mind was completely off of the upbringing that he got from his mother and from his father,
Exactly.
In terms of Elijah and Malcolm, because there's a continuum, and this is a complexity, but what did those two bring to this relationship? Elijah, in addition to being a father figure, what were his strengths? What were some of the things that his orientation was centered around? And Malcolm, his, and underneath that, how did they work together and how did they pose problems?
Right. Well, I think that both of them brought, and I talk about this in my book, both of them brought something to the table that fed the other one. Malcolm, for example, Elijah Muhammad brought him wisdom. He brought him, that strong male energy. He brought Malcolm discipline because the organization revolved around discipline, and Malcolm was in need of discipline. He also brought Malcolm solutions. Elijah Muhammad, because he had a program, he offered solutions, and Malcolm was at that stage in his life in which he needed solutions. He needed possibilities. He needed direction. And these were the things that Elijah Muhammad brought him. Flip-sided, what did Malcolm bring Elijah Muhammad? Well, he brought Elijah Muhammad extraordinary energy, Malcolm was an incredibly hard worker. And Elijah Muhammad had not seen a worker like Malcolm. He always complained in relation to his children that they were lazy compared to Malcolm, that his children, wouldn't take it to the next level like Malcolm did. He would always compare them, why can't y'all be more like Malcolm? He always is sensitive to my needs, unlike my own children. So that's one of the things that Malcolm brought to the table. He brought, analysis, because Elijah Muhammad thought well, for someone, with his background and everything. But Malcolm thought a lot more logical, a lot more, sensible, if you will, and stuff. And so Malcolm's analysis, I think, helped to, balance Elijah Muhammad's wisdom. And so what you're going to see happening here is a marriage, if you will, between Elijah Muhammad's wisdom married with Malcolm's logic and sense of logic. And I think that made, the nation and their relationship that much more effective, if you will. I think Malcolm also brought a youthful vision. Elijah Muhammad, by the time they hooked up, he was already, he could have been on most elders, elder councils and stuff when they first hooked up. But I think that what Malcolm, or what? Oh, okay, wait. I'm talking about what Malcolm brought, right? Yeah, right. So one of the most important things that I think Malcolm brought was he brought that youthful energy of fresh ideals, because remember, for Malcolm, a lot of this stuff is new. He had never been in an organization like the Nation of Islam. He never had to demonstrate the type of discipline that he had to demonstrate in the nation in his previous life. Yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that, well, on the street, there is a certain discipline that you needed to have, on the street. But the type of discipline that he has to exert within the Nation of Islam, that was all new. And I think that Elijah Muhammad, needed that type of youth. It was a good, it was a good sort of youth that I think, improved the Nation of Islam. And then the other thing, the final thing that I'll say is, remember, Malcolm was an organizer. And at the time that he and Elijah Muhammad hooked up, one of the major things that the nation needed was organizers. Because remember, before Malcolm, there was only a handful of temples across the country. When Malcolm gets on the case with his energy and his commitment and all of that, there's going to be, 10 and 20 and 30 more temples that are going to be founded all over the country, primarily because of Malcolm's youth and because of his organizational skills. Malcolm had extraordinary organizational skills, and I think that's exactly what Elijah Muhammad needed at that time. And one of the points that I make in my book is that one without the other probably would not have went as far. But the two of them together, bringing to the table the different skills that they had, made Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad an extraordinary combination.
Yeah, and those organizing skills were exceptional.
They really were.
I think he and Ella Baker were the two best organizers we produced in the second half of the 20th century. I used to say Malcolm, but I'm working on a book now, and Ella Baker is one of the masters. You really can't say that, because when you look at Ella Baker's work, it's different kind of organizing, but you can't put one on top of the other. Those two are the best. And I think that the kind of organization that the nation was suited to Malcolm's approach to organizing, which is highly disciplined, highly structured, stay in your place. I mean, this was a guy who is disciplining older people over weight. You got to stand on a scale. And if you don't meet a certain weight,
right,
and coming down on some of his best people when they did something wrong and putting them down, and insisting on people staying in their place, which would also be put on him later. But that fit the model. So yeah, these are real good observations on your part. Now, because we're setting the the stage for discussing this assassination piece. So what were some of the differences, in terms of Elijah's views of how things should go for Black folks and Malcolm's? There were similarities and they were differences. And where did some of these differences pose problems?
Yeah. Well, I would start by saying politically. Malcolm politically had a vision that was very different than Elijah Muhammad's vision. Malcolm's vision was for the nation. Remember, he would talk about how it used to bother him when rank and file brothers and sisters would say, the nation talks stuff, but they don't do nothing. They criticize people, but they're not in the streets. So Malcolm's vision was for the nation to get in the streets. He wanted them to be active in struggle. He wanted them to put what they, preached. He wanted to see them operate the type of stuff that they preach. Elijah Muhammad, on the other hand, he wanted the nation to be not a political movement. He wanted it simply to be a religious movement. There are probably different reasons for that. One of my contentions is that I think Elijah Muhammad didn't want to bring more attention on the nation for financial reasons, but also I think he feared that the FBI and some of the enemies, institutions would come after the nation, and I think that he feared that. As much as they talked a whole lot of things, I think Elijah Muhammad knew that they had built a nice, structure for himself and for his family. And I think anything that threatened that was problematic for him. And I think Malcolm, as Malcolm got more political, particularly in '63, when he was trying to pull the nation further into civil rights and self-defense and those types of things, him and Elijah Muhammad, started, getting more and more distance between them. So certainly that was a problem. I think some of the other problems is that, Malcolm started, he had more of an interest in internationalism, particularly as it pertained to Africa and also as it pertained to the Islamic world. And so I think between those two things, Elijah Muhammad was uncomfortable. He was, and let's be clear on this, he was always uncomfortable with Africa.
Right.
I remember reading some articles from Muhammad Speaks. In fact, if anybody wants to look it up, it should be June the 28th, 1968. Elijah Muhammad wrote an article, that was published in Muhammad Speaks, in which what he was doing was he was chastising members of the nation who were wearing dashikis. He was chastising people who were trying to identify, members of the nation who were trying to identify with African culture. He even used words like foreign, and trying to use foreign names and different things like that. But the point is that it reminded you that Elijah Muhammad's perspective when it came to Africa was a hell of a lot different than than Malcolm's perspective when it came, to Africa. And then the other thing too, in relation to the Islamic world, Malcolm was interested in bringing the nation in the Islamic world, seeing the nation play a more active role in the Islamic world, whereas I think Elijah Muhammad was not comfortable, on that particular stage. I don't think he was comfortable, probably for a multitude of reasons, but it just seems real clear that he was not comfortable with that. And I think from his mindset, he saw Malcolm as trying to force the nation to get out of its comfort zone. And remember too, Malcolm was also interested in making better use of the FOI, because his thing was, what's the use of having a paramilitary organization or structure within our organization if we really, don't use it? Because there was a time when he would have liked for them to kind of like do what the Deacons for Defense and Justice did, to protect the civil rights movement and, in the South and marches and stuff like that. Malcolm had visions of stuff like that for the nation. But I think that, clearly Elijah Muhammad was uncomfortable taking the nation out of its, more traditional role and to try to make it more of a struggle organization. Malcolm saw it as a struggle organization. And remember, the MMI, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, was created supposedly to correct some of the mistakes that he thought the nation had made, and so that was supposed to serve as a model for what a Black, Islamic militant organization should be about. It's just that Malcolm never really had a whole lot of time to develop the organization like he wanted and stuff. But yeah, that should have been a corrective, because Elijah Muhammad frowned upon the nation being more political. And then the other thing is that they even bumped heads because Elijah Muhammad didn't like Malcolm to even debate members. Oh, wait a minute, I did something.
You're okay here.
Okay, y'all still see me?
Yeah, I see you. You're fine.
Okay. For some reason though, I can't see myself. Let me okay, I mean I can keep going, but
yeah, we can see you.
Okay. Then I guess the other thing is that Elijah Muhammad really didn't like Malcolm even debating civil rights leaders because he viewed that as pushing them further into the civil rights camp. And he didn't, Elijah Muhammad didn't want the nation to be part of that whole civil rights camp. And I think we forget that, the conservatism of the Nation of Islam, but they were a very conservative organization, and Elijah Muhammad was happy for them just to be a conservative, religious, Black religious organization, whereas Malcolm's vision was a lot more broader, a lot more political than that.
Yeah, those are good observations. In the film, Make It Plain, there's an observation by one of his brothers where he says that Malcolm was beginning to sound more like the civil rights movement. And Brother Joseph in The Nation, who admitted at the end of his life his real negative roles in going after Malcolm, he said he just stopped believing in what Malcolm was saying because he didn't sound like the Malcolm who was walking the straight religious line. And then Malcolm had observed that he was concerned that the nation was becoming isolated from the main currents of the Black freedom movement. In 1963, Malcolm called a meeting in San Francisco of the major freedom movement leaders. He sent out notices to 60 people. 15 of us showed up. And I've been chair of C.O.R.E now for about 6 months. This was in the summer. It's not long before the split. And I remember Malcolm came to the meeting in a seersucker suit, one of these cheap little striped suits. And the minister from the Nation of Islam in LA was with him. And this was around the time that the police had attacked the nation. And I remember he's sitting, because he was in the Sun Reporter newspaper building. This is a Black newspaper for the Bay Area, run by a Black radical, Carlton Goodlett, who was Paul Robeson's replacement when Robeson was denied a passport. So he's a radical himself. And Malcolm is sitting with his back to a wall, which was always the case, with newspapers spread out. And so 15 of us come. My father was with me, and my father remembered something I didn't. He said, when you saw Malcolm, there was a goosebump that would go up and down his neck. I didn't notice that, So Malcolm was giving us the Nation of Islam line on things and quoting what was going on in the country. But this was a part of his attempt to do outreach with what he saw as the Young Turks, the young activists in the movement, because he was trying to, one, gauge the temperature, but also maintain contact. So when he finished with his discussion, I raised my hand because we're in the midst of major job campaigns. And I said, we appreciate the Nation of Islam and the good work you're doing, but we're out here fighting for jobs for Black people. Muslims are, wearing their suits and bow ties and walking in and getting the jobs, which we opened up for Black people. We have a problem with that, but they're not doing anything to help us. What the holy hell's going on? And then Malcolm gave his line, and the line was, before the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the system wouldn't be dealing with you. But because the system is so afraid of the Nation of Islam, now they're willing to deal with you. And I said, I said, the power structure is not afraid of the Nation of Islam. I want an answer. Why isn't the nation doing something? And so Malcolm said, the nation would be announcing a political action program soon. Now, I noticed in your book where you make a note of the fact that I didn't remember that Malcolm has started a voter registration campaign in Moscow 7, which was mild. And I think part of what he was saying was, because he, like Adam Clayton Powell, we can get into electoral politics. We don't have to do any nonviolence, and we're definitely not talking about integration, but we can take some part of this movement. So that's just a few months before he's put down. And so he's saying his answer was, the messenger will be announcing a political action program soon. We didn't know what that meant until after he was forced out of the nation. So it suggested that he thought that maybe he might win this internal struggle in terms of getting the nation engaged. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think the record actually, bears that out. I think, Malcolm was always hoping, because remember, keep this in mind, Malcolm could sometimes, not so much with the political thing, but he could convince Elijah Muhammad to do things sometimes that took Elijah out of his comfort zone. So I don't think it was unrealistic on Malcolm's part to think of the possibility that he can sway them. But here's the problem, though, that Malcolm is going to run into. 1963 was a difficult year in the relationship between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And this is a year in which you see Elijah Muhammad becoming much more resistant to Malcolm's ideals. There was a time, in which, if Malcolm, in his administrative duties, if he wanted to sit somebody down, the minister at such and such isn't doing a good job, the quotas are down, the fishing is down, they're not getting the numbers and stuff, I want to replace him with such and such. Well, there was a time in 61 and 62 that all Malcolm had to do was just make the recommendation, and Elijah Muhammad would basically just rubber stamp it. Well, in 63, this is when you begin to see that relationship changing, and the rubber stamping begins to get reduced more and more. And what I would suggest is that was an indication of the deterioration of the relation, in the relationship between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And in fact, I isolate an incident one time in which they were talking about the number of people Malcolm had spoke. I want to say it was in the Chicago mosque, but anyway, he had spoke. And normally, Elijah Muhammad is always happy when whatever the numbers are, but he was never critical when the numbers were not all that great as far as people who, after Malcolm spoke, joined the nation. And I want to say this was probably around May 63. They're having this conversation, Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, and Elijah asked him, well, how many people did you get last night? And Malcolm said, we signed up 15 or something like that. And Elijah Muhammad basically, cracked on him, said, well, that's not good enough. Well, I view that as an indication of a much larger challenge that was going on in their relationship. It was deteriorating. And I think I think 63, and here's the thing, 63 at the same time was also the year that Malcolm really was pushing for a more political nation, because there was, a voter registration. He wanted some unity conferences between the nation and some of the civil rights leaders. It was like a lot of things that Malcolm was pushing, and Elijah Muhammad began to resist, and it's going to reach the point by the time you're in the fall of 1963, for the most part, very little love coming to Malcolm from Elijah Muhammad from an administrative standpoint, and certainly from a political standpoint.
Your book, you note that one of the clear indications of a real problem that Malcolm was having with the messenger was when he wanted to sit down Joseph in the Harlem Temple number 7, Joseph being in charge of the fruit and hard head. And always, you point out in your book, the fruit was separate in chain of command from the minister in charge of a mosque. So you point out that indicated a problem right there.
It really did. And if I could just add something to it, what's really significant about the whole Joseph thing is that, remember, Joseph was the regional captain on the East Coast. So, a title that Elijah Muhammad had ultimately given him, which meant that he had an even larger role to play than he had like the year before or so. And so there was always this power, this kind of underlining power struggle between Malcolm and Joseph, because there was no love lost, as we, all agree, no love lost between Malcolm and Joseph. And so this was kind of like a litmus test, between who has the influence. Is it Malcolm or is it Joseph? Well, a year before, 2 years before, it would have easily have been Malcolm. But at this stage of the game, because of the deterioration of their relationship, Elijah Muhammad went with Joseph. And I think that the larger picture was that Elijah Muhammad was basically saying that he was tying his hands with Malcolm. He was tired of Malcolm. And then everything that happened after that was just icing on the cake. The Kennedy assassination and all those types of things, was just basically, just icing on the cake. The deterioration had already taken place. And then at that stage of the game, Elijah Muhammad was just looking for an excuse.
You quote in your book some thought on other thinkers who are talking about the conservative nature of the Nation of Islam as it became more successful, and then what Malcolm represented within that. You want to go into that?
Yeah, well, actually, I think Karanger gave a very good analysis of that, and his general thesis was that there was a power struggle, by the early 60s within the Nation of Islam, and the radical wing was led by Malcolm, and the conservative wing was basically led by Elijah Muhammad's family, and the national leadership, which was Elijah Muhammad's family, with the exception of John Ali. And that, so they're having this power struggle. Malcolm leading the more radical wing. They want to make the nation more serious. They want the nation to be more active. They want the nation to be a force in our struggle. And they're using race. They want to put the emphasis on race. But then you got the conservative wing, who have gotten fat and rich and wealthy. They all got Cadillacs. They all live in mansions. They don't need, in other words, they got a good thing going on here. And the stuff that Malcolm is talking about would disrupt that. It would create problems. And all that money that they got coming in as family members and all that, that would be problematic. And I think in the end, you got Elijah Muhammad was basically in the middle. Both the radical wing and the conservative wing are vying for Elijah Muhammad's attention. And he has to make a choice. And then I don't think it was a difficult choice, to be honest. But in the end, he chose the conservative wing. And that didn't leave Malcolm and some of the, people that were kind of like under his orbit, that didn't leave them with, many avenues to go. It was kind of like that was, in many ways, that was also indicative that Malcolm technically had taken the nation as far as he could pretty much take it.
Yeah, and what you're quoting there, that Karinga talks about is the iron law of oligarchy. The more conservative, the more successful a group gets, too often the more conservative it gets. And the irony is that Malcolm took a nation that was broke to 75 million in assets and himself denied any kind of material comfort at all. And this would be the thing that would turn on him. But it kind of reminds you of what happens in nations as well. I mean, this is the same kind of politics that goes on,
It really is. One other source that we want to add to this, C. Eric Lincoln, published his book, The Black Muslims in America. He also noticed when he was writing that book, he too was noticing the struggle between the conservative wing of the nation and the radical wing. And he had some interesting observations about, for the most part, whichever side Elijah Muhammad will ultimately go with will ultimately determine the future that the Nation of Islam will follow.
You discuss the FBI and the attention they took and towards the Nation of Islam. Could you describe, like, first of all, what was the first thing that attracted or got the notice of the FBI of Malcolm, and what was the FBI's general overall attitude towards the Nation of Islam?
Okay, well, what caught Malcolm's attention as far as the FBI is concerned is that in 1950, he wrote a letter. And remember, they were looking at all of the mail that were leaving, to and from prisons. And in 1950, in this letter, he was writing to like a relative or somebody. He was making a point that he was hoping that the Japanese won World War II, and that and that he was a communist. So it was the communist statement that initially caught the FBI's attention. He said that he was a communist, and so from that point forward, the Bureau opened up an investigation of him. And so any like one of the most interesting things that I found as I probe FBI files is that there was an organization in the Boston area, an African organization called the Christmas Attucks Club. And they were supposed to be a Black youth wing of the Communist Party USA, or one of the left-wing white organizations. In 1950, I think it was 1951 or 1952, the FBI records show that they visited, that someone there came and visited Malcolm and talked to Malcolm, and they made a note of it. Well, a few years later, when Malcolm is interviewed by the FBI, they ask him about that visit. Like they had the letter, so they mentioned the letter, and he said, yeah, I remember writing a letter type of thing. But they asked him about the visit for the Christmas Attucks Club, and he says that he never had a visit from the Christmas Attucks Club. So that was one of the things that I've always been curious about, because it wasn't nothing that I broke my neck with, but it was always, so did Malcolm forget, or did somebody really come, or was the Bureau just making it up I was always curious about that, but Malcolm denied that anybody for that organization ever visited him. But the FBI documents, have the date and everything. So anyway, it's just a little side order. It ain't no big deal. But I was always curious about that. So at any rate, they started investigating Malcolm. They opened up the file, and then once he got out of prison, they kind of escalated it. They kept track. They kept track of Malcolm. And then what's significant is that they noticed something. As Malcolm began organizing and fishing, for the nation, in Detroit, and then ultimately Elijah Muhammad is going to send him to other places and stuff. The Bureau began to take note of the fact that Malcolm had the ability to draw people toward him. So they acknowledged his charisma, and they acknowledged his speaking skills, and they acknowledged the way that he presented himself. And you can see in his FBI documents that they became much more concerned about mine. This is early on. They became much more concerned about the threat that Malcolm posed because of his speaking skills, because of his articulation, because of his ability to draw people toward his personality, because that made him even more of a threat to the FBI.
In terms of the FBI's attitude towards the Nation of Islam, what was their general view of the nation and their approach to the nation?
Right. Well, it's interesting. Early on, what the FBI basically saw in the nation, if you look at the files and stuff, they viewed it as a Black supremacist organization. B, they viewed it as a Black organization that hated white people. So basically, they labeled the nation as a hate group, as an anti-white hate group. So that was the initial draw to them. And so I guess in the eyes of the FBI, they were an enemy because they were not one of those groups that loved white folks and stuff. But what's interesting is that the documents also indicate that they wasn't particularly taking the nation real seriously until the 50s. And of course, that's when Malcolm, in other words, you see a different approach to the Nation of Islam once Malcolm got on the scene, and they began to look at the numbers and start realizing, wow, this organization is growing. And they weren't rocket scientists. They didn't have to be rocket scientists to know that the reason that this organization now is beginning to grow is because of this guy, Malcolm, Malcolm X Little, as he was called sometimes, in FBI documents. And so they began to take notice, which meant that they started allocating more resources in keeping tabs on Malcolm. So by the time you get into, say, like 56 and 57, they were exerting much more manpower in investigating Malcolm than they had been previously, because they're looking at the box scores and they're seeing numbers. They're seeing that this organization is growing. And they've also, the other thing that they're keeping track of too, is they're trying to keep a gauge on how our community views the Nation of Islam, particularly when Malcolm was visiting, if he was speaking somewhere and all of that. They were keeping tabs on that. And as you would know, people who have looked at the FBI files, that they would make special notes when, because of Malcolm's charisma, because of how Malcolm was being respected. And the other thing that bothered them is that because of his relationship with Elijah Muhammad, that was viewed as problematic too. Why? Because the enemy wants to create division between a Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. They don't want those two to have a strong, positive father-son type of relationship. They're trying to figure out ways to separate the two, to create tension between the two, which, by the way, they will ultimately do, as you get into 63, that's how they're going to be able to ultimately, separate Malcolm from Elijah. They're going to notice weaknesses, and then they're going to later exploit those weaknesses in their relationship.
In laying the foundation for a number of things, Malcolm's relationship with Elijah Muhammad and removal, we'll come to that. You look at the overall approach of the intelligence agencies, and particularly looking at how U.S. intelligence agencies deal with enemies as a kind of a footprint to give you an idea of what was coming. What are some of those things, because you were looking at the international arena, what are some of those things that represent a footprint for how America approached enemies?
Yeah, well, it had different levels. So why don't we just start with the top? Of the United States, starting after, the CIA was created in 1947 with the National Security Act. And within the first, by the second year in 1949 was the first evidence we had. No, but actually, technically, we could actually go back to 1943. 1943 was the first official sanctioned assassination by the United States. And of course, that was during World War II. So it's kind of like a different fabric to it. But Yamamoto was a rear admiral for the Japanese, Royal Fleet. And this was the guy who he was Harvard educated, but he planned Pearl Harbor. And he was considered to be the most prominent, the most skilled military commander in the Japanese, Navy and, Army as well, but he was in the Navy. So what happened was in 1943, the United States government intercepted. They had cracked the Japanese code without the Japanese knowing it. And so they had intercepted a dispatch which said that Yamamoto was going to be visiting a Japanese fleet near the Solomon Islands. So they dispatched like 18 bombers. And they had one goal and one goal only: to intercept Yamamoto's escort and kill him. And, this was signed off by Roosevelt, who's the president at the time, and the Secretary of Defense. So they signed off on. Anyway, make a long story short, Yamamoto was killed. So that was 1943. So he becomes the first official assassination that the United States participated in. Well, during the Cold War, after the CIA was created, they have a new vehicle in place. And that new vehicle in place is going to assassinate, by 1960, they would have assassinated somewhere about at least around 13 heads of states, where people of color, countries that are led by people of color. So assassination became kind of like the ultimate neutralization method that the United States utilized. But there were two other major ones outside of assassination that they also like to use. Imprisonment was an important one. And then basically exiling somebody, getting somebody removed, kicked out somewhere. And so those were three of the majors that I talk about. But of course, that's looking at the much broader picture. What we need to be concerned about as well, and this also played out in Malcolm's case, was the various tactics that the enemy utilized, that is, the intelligence community utilized when they went after political enemies, which is what Malcolm X was. And there, we bring in, what they call counterintelligence techniques and tactics, as well as counterintelligence operations. Now, people get confused by this, and let me kind of clear it up. When people talk about COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, many of them, they think about the 1960s. And they particularly think about the Black Hate one that Hoover authorized that August 25th, 1967, 2 years after Malcolm had been killed. But here's the 2.5 years actually. But here's the thing: the tactics that were used in the 67 COINTELPRO that gets all the play were already being used by the FBI, technically going all the way back to the Garvey movement. And I think we forget that sometimes. So you don't have to, in other words, people say, well, they were doing all these things in 67, we know. But Malcolm was killed before that. So what were they doing against Malcolm? It was the same damn tactics that they were using. And in fact, look at it from this standpoint. The first official COINTELPRO was 1956. That was against the Communist Party USA. The next one was 1961, and that was the Socialist Workers' Party. The one after that was 1964, and that was the White Hate Klan COINTELPRO. The next one was the Black Nationalist one that gets all the play. That was 67. And then the final one was 1968, and that was against the New Left. But the point that we want to be sensitive to is that the Bureau, every tactic that you saw them using in those other COINTELPROs, they were already using against organizations like the Nation of Islam, along with the Klan and the Socialist Workers' Party and the Communist Party and the so-called New Left. And of course, the Black Nationalists.
So let's get into the Nation of Islam, the FBI's role in terms of the relationship of Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, and some of the role that they played in terms of trying to create or actually creating or extending rifts that were already there or helping to create them.
Right. Well, one of the things that we just want to keep in mind is that when the FBI was doing their disruption program, and that's the term that they like to use instead of COINTELPRO, they would use the term disruption. But everything, like I said, that was in the COINTELPRO program was in the disruption program. What the FBI did is that they calculated by 62, 63. And what they determined was that there's only one way to create division within the ranks of the Nation of Islam, and that is you have to separate Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. In fact, if I can, I want to read something, a very important document that I was able to come across when I was doing my research. Because what they do in this particular document, it's the March 1963 document. It was the March 10th document. And what they're basically doing is the FBI is telling you how they're going to separate Malcolm from Elijah Muhammad. And let me kind of like set the stage for it. This was in 1963, and they had just had the Savior's Day that year in Chicago. So Malcolm is in Chicago, and he stays a little bit, extra to get some stuff done. Because remember, the Chicago mosque was a mess, and that was Elijah Muhammad's, in the backyard. And Malcolm's philosophy was that mosque should be the most organized, the most disciplined, the most, the best running of all the mosques. And so that created a problem right there, because think about the message that that's sending to Elijah Muhammad. You know, Malcolm thinking that, you know, this mosque should be better than everybody else, but it's not. So why is it? Well, because Elijah Muhammad apparently ain't doing something. So anyway, what's happening here is that the FBI is really watching the relationship between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad during this particular time, because there was a lot of other events that had been happening that was creating tension between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad previously. So they are very sensitive to what's going on. So part of what's happening is there's a lot of tension between the family, Elijah Muhammad's family, which, by the way, the name that people gave the Elijah Muhammad's family was the royal family, which, by the way, a name that Malcolm actually created. The concept of the royal family, that is Elijah Muhammad's sons and daughters, Malcolm created that. And in fact, I remember interviewing Wilford, you know, Malcolm's oldest brother, and he was telling me, he was saying that, you know, that this royal family will ultimately, you know, be Malcolm's major headache within the Nation of Islam, and that they're going to ultimately, Elijah Muhammad will ultimately side with his children against Malcolm, you know, because that's the big power struggle that we're leading up to right now. But one of the points that Wilford made to me was, he said, you know, the concept of the royal family, you know, he said Malcolm created it. And then he said Malcolm created the monster that destroyed him. And I really had to, to appreciate what he was saying. Okay, so let me just read this real quick, okay? So what's happening here is that the SAC, that's Special Agent in Charge of the Chicago Bureau. And in fact, this is the same punk that will help to orchestrate Fred Hampton's assassination December 1969. This is the same special agent in charge. His name is Marlon Johnson. So what they're doing right now is they're noticing that the longer that Malcolm stayed in Chicago, the more the tension between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, you know. And so what Marlon Johnson is doing right now is he's assessing, is it to the Bureau's advantage to do anything or to let nature take its course? Or should they introduce some new disruptive things now that they know that Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm are starting to kind of separate a little bit? Should they be doing something else? So this is what Marlon Johnson said. And when he says Chicago, he's talking about the Chicago FBI. So this is what he wrote to Hoover, March 1963, quote, "At this point, Chicago does not recommend that any disruption tactics in the form of anonymous letters or phone calls be instituted. It is apparent Elijah Muhammad at this time is backing Malcolm and is giving him to some degree a free hand. It is also apparent Muhammad has no intentions of allowing Malcolm to get out of bounds. Chicago also feels that any anonymous letters or calls at this time could possibly identify the source of the information and could, instead of causing disruption, solidify the royal family and Malcolm." And he goes on to say, "It is felt that Malcolm's presence in Chicago is the most adequate form of disruption possible, as it is causing extreme discontent in the royal family and may well set off a chain reaction which could cause Malcolm to fall in disfavor with Muhammad." Now, this document was important for several reasons. Number one, the FBI is reminding you of the ongoing disruption campaign that they have within the nation. But they also mentioned two tactics that they have been using all along. The poison pen, they talk about the poison pen and anonymous letters. These were two of the most important tactics that the Bureau will use to help later on to distance Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And so the Bureau is talking very boldly and letting people know. And remember, this is really just between the Chicago headquarters, SAC, and Hoover. But they're letting you know that the key to their program is to separate, using all types of crooked things and tactics, counterintelligence techniques, to separate Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. That's what the game plan is. And by the end of 1963, they're going to see the fruits of their labor.
Now, you make the point that one of the things that they let play out and also encourage was the conflicts within what Malcolm had defined as the royal family and the conflicts coming from them against Malcolm. You want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Remember, the tension between Malcolm and the royal family is a natural tension. And the reason that I use the word a natural tension is because just look at the reality. The reality is that Elijah Muhammad is not going to be there forever. And somebody's going to have to take over. And going all the way back to the, to the late 50s, early 60s, it was thought that it would either be Malcolm or it would be a member of the royal family. In most cases, it would have, Elijah Muhammad would have liked Ethel, his daughter, who is also the supreme captain of the, women's, of the MGT, the women's, civilization program. She would have been his choice among his children if only she was a male. But because of the paternalism of the nation, it was either going to have to be Raymond Sharif, her husband, who's Elijah Muhammad's, son-in-law, or Wallace, who Elijah Muhammad was always leaning toward, and also possible Junior, Elijah Muhammad Jr. Those were basically the major, and possibly if he went outside the family, it would have been John Ali. So these were always the people that were part of the whole secession thesis. And so what we're seeing happening here is part of the conflict between Malcolm and the royal family revolves around the question, who will take over for the old man when he dies? And of course, the royal family's thing was, as long as it's one of them, they're good, but they don't want it to be Malcolm. So that's what's going to create this natural tension between Malcolm and the royal family. And what they all agree upon is that it shouldn't be Malcolm. So how does this play out? Any opportunity from around 61 on, any opportunity that the royal family had to complain about Malcolm to Elijah Muhammad, they're going to do it. And of course, Elijah Muhammad complicated things more because he would say stuff to the family, y'all just jealous of Malcolm. Malcolm works harder than anybody else. Y'all just jealous. Malcolm loves me and this organization more than all of y'all. And so Elijah Muhammad kind of like in the middle, kind of egging it on and playing the two sides and stuff. All of this creates a problem. So what's the Bureau doing? They're studying all of this. How are they studying it? Using different concepts. They have bugged Elijah Muhammad's headquarters. They have bugged Elijah Muhammad's home. They have bugged Malcolm's home. They have bugged the national headquarters of the Nation of Islam. And they have bugged the individual homes of royal family members. Now, why is this important? Because they're hearing everything that's being said in private about Malcolm, about what Malcolm is saying about the royal family and what the royal family is saying about Malcolm. They're hearing all of this. And what they're doing as counterintelligence operators is they're taking notes. Anytime they hear Elijah Muhammad react to something said about Malcolm in a negative light, they're making notes on it, and they're looking and they're measuring the reaction. And if it's a real rise, then they make a note and say, we're going to exploit this. You know, what did they say? Well, they were talking about how, like there was this one time in which they're like listening to Elijah Muhammad is talking to one of his children. And what was basically said was this. They said, and this is the children talking now, so we don't know how credible this was, but what it was is that Malcolm was talking to some of the family members, and they were saying that Malcolm had made a statement that no serious African person stays in a white neighborhood, something like that, right? And so one of the family members says to Malcolm, and this is them telling it, okay, says to Malcolm, well, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad stays in a white neighborhood. And they claim when they talked to Elijah Muhammad that Malcolm said something to the degree, well, that's my point. And so they went and they told Elijah Muhammad, and the FBI got this, on their bugs and stuff. And so what the Bureau's thing for that point would say, we need to do some bad jacketing. Bad jacketing is the spreading of false rumors. So what they would basically do is, from that point, the Bureau would then, and remember, the Bureau has several informants and also agent provocateurs within the Nation of Islam. So what do? They go to their agent provocateurs or to their informants, and they say, we have a rumor that we want you to start circulating. What's the rumor? We want you to circulate that Malcolm has been critical of Elijah Muhammad's, where Elijah Muhammad lives. He lives in a neighborhood that has white people in it. So start circulating that. Because what are they hoping for? They're hoping that based on Elijah Muhammad's previous reaction, that when he hears this again, then his thing is going to be, Malcolm must have said it, and how dare Malcolm go there talking behind my back like that. That's how counterintelligence worked. They find something, they exploit it to the maximum degree, and then what they're doing is they are relying on the targets, in this case, Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, to react the way that they want them to react. So they want Elijah Muhammad to respond in a negative way whenever something like this comes up. And what's it going to do? It's going to create more distance between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And that's how counterintelligence is supposed to work.
Now, you make the point, which is a very important point. It's not usually stressed, that Malcolm came up with the idea of the royal family that would turn on him. Malcolm is also the one that recommends John Ali to Elijah Muhammad, and he was at least an informant for the FBI, at least. And I've talked to a person that was in the nation for a while, and I asked him, what was the qualities of John Ali? And he was an accountant. FBI agents were accountants. He was not an agent, he was an informant. But he said, whatever John Ali did worked. You know what I mean? And Malcolm put him there. And Louis Lomax had pointed it out to him, that you made a big mistake on this one. He didn't know what he was doing. Now going to your point here, you're also describing a template for how the FBI generally moved on the Black Liberation Movement and a lot of other groups. Panther Us, playing egos against each other. And the Panthers themselves. My own organization, we face the same things. There's some lessons here, because I've had 3 assassination attempts on me. This finger here, 18 people sent after me. I had a guy come to shoot me at my house. And they ran low intensity on us, that's far more sophisticated than COINTELPRO. You familiar with low intensity?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But you can beat this. This is the side I want to drop in here. You can beat it. If Malcolm had an organization like him, that stuff wouldn't have worked. You know, yeah, they could come and shoot you if they want to try, but the playing of weaknesses, we all have weaknesses, but if you have a disciplined core and, you know, you got some smart people and you have a security section that's doing their own counter work, counterinsurgency work, but basically your leadership is basically clean because the FBI was playing on weaknesses in the nation, weaknesses of the messenger, especially.
Exactly.
And that just opened them up to everything else. We all have weaknesses, and there's always something that can be exploited. But if you handle these weaknesses so they're not major, then it's very hard for these things to work. Us and Panthers had the egos been under control, that would have been a big part of it, you know. And there were certain people in the Panthers, for example, Bunchy Carter, who was trying to resolve stuff. He was killed. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we're going into this, but it's important that people get the idea. This doesn't always have to work. Castro avoided 400 assassination attempts. You know what I mean? For a lot of reasons. And of course, we're not in our own island away from the US, but as you pointed out, they got their reach. So now going back into the nation's game, so so they play on the issues that the royal family, so-called royal family, has. And this leads to Malcolm's expulsion. In your book, you said this was pretty much coming. You say chickens come home to roost. That was the excuse. You want to explain that?
Yeah. If you look at it, and I try to chronicle it in my book, 1963, you see the deterioration of the relationship, in part because the FBI is busy and doing what they do, but also because, the Elijah Muhammad is open to the tactics. In other words, the tactics work because of how Elijah Muhammad reacts to it and because of how the nation reacts, the national leadership, and to some degree, the way that Malcolm reacts to it. Without their reactions, the Bureau could not have been able to have gotten, where they, where they were. But let me just give you just a couple things about how the FBI counterintelligence program worked. In May 1963, Elijah Muhammad is staying in the Phoenix mansion. And it's him and it's like one other person there who's supposed to be helping him. And the Bureau, of course, have all of his, conversations, being bugged and recorded. So Elijah Muhammad's sick. He was throwing up blood. He was in pain. And there was really nobody there to really help him. So he's talking on the phone to, I think it was one of the kids. And he says to them, I'm in pain. I'm throwing up blood. I feel like I'm going to die. I just want to kill myself. So he says that to one of his faithfuls. The Bureau listens to this, hears this, and for the next week, there's a series of phone calls to the Phoenix estate in which anonymous people are calling Elijah Muhammad, telling him he should kill himself. That's counterintelligence. They got an opening, and it was as simple as that.
King, the same thing they did with him, because they knew he had jumped out of a window when he was very young. I think his grandmother died or something. And so they saw a proclivity to suicide, encouraged it. Yeah.
Right. And so that's why in October 1964, when he was in, Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, 34 days before that, William Sullivan, who's the number 3 person at the FBI and the person who's in charge of the domestic intelligence division, he sends a poison pen letter to to King, telling him that he had 34 days to kill himself. Otherwise, they're going to release, some information about his sex life and stuff like that. But yeah, that's how it works.
So,
and it's been effective. It's been effective for, it was effective for a long time.
yeah, and as you say, had they not fallen for it, it wouldn't have been effective. And so, yeah, and of course, it's playing on human frailties.
Yeah.
So your frailties are great, then it's like you're driving a Mack truck through it. You're almost asking for it, So Malcolm is removed from the nation for allegedly saying chickens come home to roost, but you're showing all the different things that are leading up to that, and it was going to be one thing or the other anyway. What does the FBI then do? And what role is the nation playing when Malcolm's under suspension?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Once the Bureau really went to work then, and one of the things that they're going to use is they're going to basically launch a two major campaigns against Malcolm during the suspension. One was a newspaper campaign, and what that was is that the Bureau has a stable of journalists known as certified friends, and whenever the Bureau want to influence public opinion, they go. These are basically journalists, legitimate reporters who are on the FBI payroll. And whenever the FBI wanted an article or an editorial or something written about, to promote a certain ideal, they go to these certified friends and they tell them, this is what we need you to say. This is what we want you to say. And then these people, they're on the FBI payroll, they will basically follow it and stuff. So the FBI is going to launch a newspaper campaign because they know the newspapers that Elijah Muhammad reads, that Malcolm reads. And so they're going to put articles in those newspapers. And these are basically just articles that are designed to simply create more schism between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And I'll just give you some general ideas of what the articles would normally say. Normally, they would take a side. Either they would take a side and be on Malcolm's side, or they would be on Elijah Muhammad's side. If they were on Malcolm's side, they would say something like, well, all Malcolm did was tell the truth. Kennedy was a devil. But if they were on Elijah Muhammad's side, they would say, Malcolm is a publicity hound. And by the way, where did they get that from? They got that from Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was talking to somebody one time, this was like a couple years before, and he made a statement that basically says, Malcolm loves the cameras too much. Malcolm loves to be in the press too much. And so any opportunity that the FBI would get to kind of inflame that, to crack, to basically utilize that, they would basically do it. And they're going to, by the way, do that a lot during the suspension period. The other thing that they would use was letters. They would use the mails. Sometimes it was a poison pen letter in which somebody is writing as an anonymous person. And then they would cover all of the points that the FBI wanted covered. I have one or two in my book of poison pen letters. And basically, it's almost like a template, to use your word. It's like a template, because what they would do is, in those letters, they would put all the stuff that they knew Elijah Muhammad or Malcolm had reacted to in a negative way previously. And it was like you could just check off the boxes. They knew that they didn't like this. They knew that they didn't like that. They knew that, and they would make sure it's all in that letter. It's like one call does it all. So these were, and then there was a third approach that they would use, would be the bad jacketing. And, that's when they basically would spread false rumors. The Bureau would create a rumor that they knew would piss off Elijah Muhammad or piss off the royal family or piss off Malcolm, and then they would get their informants inside the nation to exploit, to basically spread it. Have you heard what the minister said this about Elijah Muhammad? Are you serious? Yeah. And, we know how that works. Once you start to, spread that seed, it just goes around and around, and it creates more tension between the people who are involved in it.
Now, you show once that Malcolm was suspended initially, that Elijah's in contradictory positions in relationship to Malcolm. And then the FBI is trying to respond to that. That's part of what good writing and good research is. It goes into the contradictions. It's not all black and white. And I think that's one of the things that makes your research exceptional and outstanding. So explain some of the back and forth that's going on with Elijah when Malcolm's on suspensions, his attitude towards Malcolm and Malcolm's response and the government's role in that.
Right. Okay. So remember, under the terms of Malcolm's suspension, so he's suspended, and under the terms of, well, first off, that's a problem. The terms of the suspension. Malcolm had initially assumed when he was suspended that it was for 90 days because that's the standard practice. Elijah Muhammad would later say, I never gave 90 days. It was indefinite. And then ultimately, one of the problems is that when the 90 days are up, Malcolm's going to start speaking. That's going to create more problems between the two because they never resolved what it was. But at any rate, be that as it may, part of the problem, during the break is that Elijah Muhammad was constantly hearing rumors that we now know were basically started by the FBI, that Malcolm was not taking his suspension well. And the type of stuff that they would hear is, like, I'll give you an example. Malcolm would be quoted in an article, for example. And remember, Malcolm's not supposed to be talking to the press either. Even though we do know of at least one time when he did talk to Ted Poston of the New York Post. That seems to be legitimate, in which Malcolm, called him up at night and, gave him something. Otherwise, Malcolm took his suspension the way that he was supposed to. But this is what the Bureau would do. They would have somebody write an article, and somehow they would quote Malcolm. They just make up stuff. They just make up shit. And they would quote Malcolm, saying this or saying that, when right now, remember, under the terms of his suspension, he's not supposed to be talking to the press. So these were some of the ways that the Bureau would exploit, the times when Malcolm is silent and is not supposed to be talking, but yet they would keep Malcolm out there through a newspaper article as if he was quoted. Now, they're listening for Elijah Muhammad's response. So somebody calls up Elijah Muhammad. I just read an article in the New York Times in which they quoted Malcolm. Well, what Malcolm say? He said blah, blah, blah. And Elijah Muhammad would react by saying that's another strike against him. No analysis, no investigation. He could have got on the phone and even called up Malcolm and said, you were quoted in the New York Times. Was that you or not? None of that happened very much during the suspension. And that, of course, the Bureau is booking on that. Because remember this, one of the best ways to neutralize the enemy when they're using poison pens in the media and all these little tactics that they like to use. And this is, by the way, this is what, there's a good example of this took place when the enemy was trying to create a war between the Peace Stone Nation led by Jeff Fort and Fred Hampton in Chicago. They had, circulated these things and put out these things, and the Panthers had put a hit out on you, Jeff Fort. Ford is saying, no, I'm going to put out a hit on them if they did it. Blah, 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 blah. What did Fred Hampton and Jeff Fort do? They had a conversation. Because see, the enemy is hoping that the blood is so bad between the people that they won't do a simple thing like, hey, let's set up a meeting because, hey, I just heard that you put out a hit on me and we need to talk about that. Huh? I ain't putting no hit on, well, we need to talk about it. That's how you neutralize it. But see, the enemy is booking on the fact that because the blood is bad and we're going to buy whatever the Bureau has put out there, then we're not going to do that. And of course, that was also a problem with Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. There was very little communication. But check this out. When there was communication, remember when I read that March the 10th quotation FBI file, when they were trying to do some communication, then the Bureau would do things like they would intercept letters between the two men. Or in some cases, when they say poison pen, that means that they would basically snatch a letter and then send another letter in its place that says the things that the Bureau wants them to say. So we got all of this going on during that suspension period that's going to create more friction between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad.
So all of this is happening, and then finally Malcolm decides that he's out, and he begins to make moves of his own. Because I want to get back into the assassination, but what are some of the things that Malcolm is doing in this interim period once he's severed from the nation? What are some of the principal objectives that he has, and how's that viewed by both the nation and the FBI?
Right. Let me deal with the FBI first. Malcolm outside the nation is problematic for the FBI because now they realize that without Elijah Muhammad's constraints, they're fearing now that they're going to be able to see the full range of Malcolm's creativity. And because remember, Elijah Muhammad, as much as anything, was able to basically restrain Malcolm because of his philosophy and his ideals and what he wanted the nation to be about. I'm talking about Elijah Muhammad. So he restrained Malcolm. The FBI is much more concerned when Malcolm is outside of the nation than they were when he was inside the nation, because those filters are not there. So Malcolm is free to be as creative as he wants to be without Elijah Muhammad saying you can't do that and stuff. So that's one thing. But some of the other things that we just want to keep in mind is that one of the advantages to Malcolm once he's out the nation is that he's putting himself in a position in which he can actualize some of his major differences with Elijah Muhammad. So Elijah Muhammad said that you can't be political. Well, Malcolm can now create a more political organization. Elijah Muhammad said he doesn't want to identify with foreign nations, African nations, or anybody else. Well, Malcolm can now create an organization that can identify with African nations. Elijah Muhammad said, no, I don't want to do that international Islamic stuff. Well, now Malcolm can deal with the international Islamic stuff. So basically, in the eyes of the enemy, Malcolm is more dangerous. And now they're going to have to allocate a lot more resources to try to keep up with Malcolm now that he's not under the umbrella of the Nation of Islam.
And what's the nation's view of this at this point?
Okay, well, Malcolm is setting himself up in the eyes of the nation to be, to be an adversary, B, to be a competitor. The nation views the MMI as competition. So now Malcolm is going to try to create a rival organization. And so in the eyes of the nation, he's challenging the dominion of Elijah Muhammad. He's challenging the leadership of Elijah Muhammad. So this is not going to be viewed as a positive, and he's going to start taking away some of the followers inside the nation. He's going to start challenging that. None of this is viewed as a positive in the eyes of the Nation of Islam. So, of course, it's going to create more division and more of a schism between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm is going to become more and more of, of a villain, more and more of the enemy to the nation.
One of the things that I really like about your analysis is you're showing the streams and the tracks that are coming on Malcolm. I don't like that, but it's showing the nature of what was happening. And so what's the Nation of Islam's motives? Because we're looking at the assassination of Malcolm X. What are their motives, and what action is coming from them to indicate that those motives are being carried out?
Yeah, well, when you bring in a nation, something that we really haven't talked about, we got to talk about the babies. Because the babies is going to be a major vehicle that's going to be used by the FBI, and it's going to be used by Malcolm in this whole in the tension between Malcolm and the national leadership, between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And of course, the babies thing is that Malcolm had discovered, he had heard rumors earlier, but then by 1963, and then and then even after he was out, he even interviewed some of the women. He realized that Elijah Muhammad had not only had affairs with teenagers, but he had impregnated several of them, and that they had children by him, and sometimes multiple children. And by the way, what's not talked about very much is that one of the women had been someone that Malcolm had wanted to marry. And Elijah Muhammad never gave his blessings for this is pre-Betty, and Elijah Muhammad never gave his blessings for him. And then Malcolm later finds out that it was because he had Elijah Muhammad had his own eyes on this woman. And so these are
there's speculation that Malcolm really loved this woman, yeah, and that long after his death, she was at his graveyard for years,
Yeah.
So this wasn't just another woman. This was probably the woman for Malcolm.
Yeah, and if you think about it, from Malcolm's standpoint, that's like the ultimate betrayal. And so there is going to, and this point is important. What it means is that there is going to be bad blood on both sides of the track. It's just not the nation having bad blood at Malcolm. Malcolm has his own axis to grind. So we do want to, that point is important, in this discussion. And so ultimately, the Bureau in some ways is not going to have to do a whole lot of work. They are, but they're not going to have to do a lot of work once Malcolm is out of the nation. Why? Because in many ways, the natural tension that has always been there is simply going to start playing its most, it's going to run its most natural course. But the Bureau will still be in the background, doing their poison pen letters, planting their newspapers, spreading, spreading, false rumors and things like that. So they're still going to be on the case. But my point is that Malcolm and Elijah are going to make some of the same mistakes that other groups that were, victimized by COINTELPRO are going to make, after them. And of course, these are some of the lessons that we need to learn as African peoples and stuff.
And what were a few of those mistakes, particularly leading up to Malcolm's assassination?
Well, to start with, and I want to look at it from Malcolm's standpoint, first. Security. Security was a major issue for Malcolm. He was surrounded by people, who may have had his best interests at heart. Some of them may not have. I raised questions like that in my book, but most of them clearly did. But Malcolm needed security people. He needed people with skills. He needed people who would have his back. And one of the weaknesses, one of the mistakes that we made is that we never really took the seriousness of the threats against Malcolm as seriously as we should have. So that was one mistake. But then in addition to that, we needed to have had skills. Malcolm needed to have been around people who are not there for the show, but people who got skills, people who can handle weapons, people who know, the techniques and the mechanics of self-defense, of being on the offensive if you need to, of basically throwing yourself between a bullet, meant for Malcolm. Malcolm needed all of that. And, when push came to shove, he didn't have it, so that was a major problem. As far as the nation is concerned, the way that they looked at all of this is that when Malcolm made the babies public, that was in June 1964, then as far as the nation was concerned, who, by the way, had already attempted, you know, by Malcolm's own account, there were already several attempts on his life even before June 1964. But the point is that once Malcolm, started talking about the babies and he went public with it, first on the radio, then in an interview, and, mentioned it here and there in some of his speeches and stuff like that, then all bets were off as far as the nation is concerned. And at that stage, the FBI could have just packed up all of its bags and, and Malcolm's assassination was inevitable.
Yeah, and you give a lot of reasoning for why Malcolm exposed the babies, and he had to protect himself and a whole lot of other stuff. But there's a flaw that Malcolm had. And I'm not blaming him for this because, as you point out, in the suspension period, he pretty much stuck to the requirements. He pretty much followed the rules. He wanted to come back. How long he would have stayed in the nation after he saw his idol fall, Elijah Muhammad, that's a whole nother question. How long could his stomach stay in? But this whole thing around the babies and also contesting the house, which should have been his, but he never put it in his name. One of Malcolm's big weaknesses is he was very good at listening to the public, very good listener. But in private, it was very hard for him to take advice. I think he took a lot of advice from the messenger, but it went against his own weaknesses. And I think chickens come home to roost was also part of Malcolm's nature. You know what I mean? To say what you really wanted to say. So anyone in the nation would tell you, Malcolm don't listen. Inside, personal, public, yes. And so that was a weakness. But as you point out, you really can't blame Malcolm for this. He's caught in a bind. He knows his life is being threatened. He knows there's attempts on his life and everything else. So it's not like he's saying something that will cause him to be killed. They were already making efforts to kill him, Right. So, I think there's that balance in the whole thing. So when it comes to the actual issue of the assassination, what's your conclusions on who did it? What sections in the nation, if it was a nation, what hand did the FBI have in it? What's your overall conclusions on that?
Right. Well, what my research basically found is that the nation had organized several assassination teams that would meet periodically in their respective towns and talk about killing Malcolm. But by far the most serious was the Newark team. And of course, Newark is just right across the river from Harlem, which is where Malcolm, basically, the Harlem area was where his headquarters was. The family lived in Queens, but Newark was within shooting range, if you will. And so the Newark team began to start meeting somewhere in the late spring of 1964. And they would meet periodically. They were all members of Mosque number 25, which is Newark. They were led by the assistant secretary, a man by the name of Albert Ben Thomas. And they recruited people. And in the end, they recruited 5 people. Talmadge Hare, who will fire the 45. Wilbur Bradley or Willie Bradley, who will fire the J.C. Higgins 12 gauge sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. Leon Davis, who will fire the 38. And a man by the name of Wilbur. We've had like different variations of his name, and we're still not really, clear on it. But he will basically be one of the people who will run interference and who will cause a commotion. So that's the 5-man murder team. So they go into the Audubon Ballroom on February 21st, 1965. And they had been meeting periodically, and they decided the night before, according to Hare, that they were ready to do it. And so they went to the Audubon. Why the Audubon? Because they knew Malcolm was going to be there. So that's how the Audubon enters the picture. And they wanted to send a message by killing Malcolm in front of his public. So all of that was, we know, for example, that Captain Joseph knew in advance, and that he sent one of the lieutenants, Linwood Cathcart, sent him to be his eyes and ears. Immediately after assassination, we know that Cathcart will make a phone call to Joseph. And how do we know that? Because Joseph was interviewed by Spike when they were working on the Malcolm X movie, and that's what Joseph said in the interview, that he was asked, when did you know about Malcolm's assassination? He said, I knew immediately after it happened. How did you know? Because we had people there, and they called me, and they gave me a blow by blow. And of course, in the end, the goal was just basically 3 men were going to shoot Malcolm, 2 were going to run interference and cause a commotion, and then they were just going to get out. And in the end, 4 of them got out. Hare was the only one who didn't get out. And he's going to be captured. The other 4 will ultimately melt into the crowd, and they're out, and none of them will ever, other than Hare, nobody else would do any time for Malcolm, who were part of the killing machine. None of them will ever be held accountable for Malcolm's assassination. Now, ultimately, what's going to happen is they're going to frame 2 innocent men. Butler and Johnson were well-known lieutenants in Mosque number 7, the Harlem Mosque. Both of them had reputations of being anti-Malcolm. And that's who the Bureau will ultimately finger and then drop them in the lap of the NYPD. The people who fingered Butler and Johnson, none of them were credible witnesses. None of them. All of them had holes in their testimony for the obvious reason that neither man was there. But in the end, Hare, Butler, and Johnson are going to be convicted, and they're going to be sentenced with life for killing Malcolm. Now, one point that we do want to make, though, Hare. Hare, when he first testified in the trial, he said that he wasn't there, and he was in the area, but he wasn't there. He didn't kill Malcolm. He did that. And that the crowd, he was walking down the street and the crowd just basically identified him as an assassin. In other words, he lied. But what ended up happening was on February the 20, let me see, that was February 28th, 1966. He retook the stand, admitted his own guilt, and said that Butler and Johnson were innocent. And he later told his lawyer, counselor, and a few other people that he knew that these men had nothing to do with Malcolm's assassination, but that he had made up his mind that if it looked like they were going to be, they had evidence and that they could be convicted, he would tell the truth. And he said when he saw all these witnesses, one after the other, just lying on these men, he made a determination that he was going to go ahead and admit his own guilt. So he pretty much signed his own death warrant for the most part, even though it ain't death because he's still alive. But he admitted during the trial that Butler and Johnson were innocent. But in the end, all three of them were convicted.
Malcolm's house had been firebombed shortly before his assassination.
Yeah, a week before.
And when Joseph was asked, did the mosque have anything to do with it, he said no. But before his death, he said, yeah, we did it.
Yeah. In fact, he gave up he talked a lot of stuff in his later years. And what was scary about Joseph is that his hatred for Malcolm seemed to have gotten worse over time. I mean, it's not an overstepping anything to say that Joseph hated Malcolm to the very end. And he even bragged about Malcolm got what he deserved. He had no regrets in anything. And for all practical purposes, he also said that the nation killed Malcolm. So he never really, in his later years, he never shied away from that. And that's why he was able to get that phone call.
Wrapping up, what do you see as the overall impact of Malcolm's assassination on the Black liberation movement? How did it affect the movement itself?
Well, Malcolm was the bridge in so many ways. He was the bridge between the Black liberation movement and the civil rights movement. He was the bridge between more conservative Black thought and Black power. He was this bridge. He was this bridge between African people, looking at Islam from a domestic standpoint to looking at it from an international standpoint, because people from the continent who were Muslims, Malcolm is going to draw them too. And so he is this bridge. He is the bridge between us going from nonviolence to self-defense to us going to armed revolution. Malcolm, he's in the middle of all of this. He's the connective dots in all of this. And so what I think happened is that, by Malcolm being removed from the scene, I think that special voice, that could link a Martin Luther King and the civil rights leadership with a Black nationalist, a Pan-Africanist, a Black power leadership, like the Panthers and different things like that. It would have been so much better for us to have a direct link instead of Malcolm being basically a martyr. And then we got to figure out another way to fill the void that he basically left. Because, think about it, 1965, it's in the middle of the 60s is when we lose Malcolm. It's a transitional period when we lose Malcolm. And so we can play with what would have been, could have been, and all that type of stuff. But I think the bottom line is that, by losing Malcolm during that time period, I think it led to creating more, how should we say it, a lesser transition to these different groups, to these different periods. I think it would have been a smoother transition had we had Malcolm's voice, so when we were linking the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement, I think it would have been a better transition for our people.
Yeah, I'd add a few things to that, and I think those are correct. Malcolm had prophesied that the generation of the 60s knew what it wanted. The generation that followed would know how to get it. And Malcolm was prophetic. Most of his prophetic statements proved true. That one didn't. And in part because what hits Black communities after Malcolm's death is something he couldn't predict. Globalization, deindustrialization, drugs are dropped into the Black community,
Right.
assassination of leadership on a mass scale. A huge generation gap develops between the young and the old. And so these were moves that were not foreseeable. And though prophetic people often see things, nobody sees everything. So losing him even hurt more under those circumstances. And not just him, the Panthers being crushed and a number of other groups, because the brains, the most advanced thinking in the movement was gone. King had advanced to a level of Malcolm on revolutionary thought about restructuring the system. And I think there's a real key point to get straight about Malcolm. Malcolm had been a Garveyite at one point, but by the end of his life, I mean, if you listen to the last message, Malcolm is talking about, whereas he thought that the most important struggle in the world that threatened the West was the one on the outside of the house in Africa. He now concluded the last message, and I think it was his best speech, not rhetorically, but in terms of thought, because you're seeing a lot of things about where he's gone. He's under sedation. It was not a speech. And he said, but he had come to realize it's the Africans inside the house that are the greatest threat. And he's particularly talking about us. He said, provided that we understand our strategic position. And then he also started making analogies. King had concluded that the problem in America was structural. Malcolm said, just as a chicken isn't designed to produce a duck egg, America's not designed to produce freedom. If a chicken could produce a duck egg, it'd be a revolutionary chicken. If America was structured for freedom, it would be a revolutionary system. Malcolm seemed to be moving in that direction. Nobody had the answers at that point. Your point about the transitional period, that's correct. 65 is where the movement achieved its objectives in the South. Desegregation, voting rights. Where do you go after that? People were not clear. And so, when you lose a major general, like say your top general,
right,
a major strategist, because literally his human rights strategy was taken out when they took him out, then it's a big fat setback. Now, this is something that most people do not know. I have a friend, his name was Paolo, and he's from the Caribbean. And he was a special kind of engineer that works in rural villages all over the world. He knew Malcolm. He went to university in California, knew Malcolm then. He met Malcolm in Africa in Malcolm's 1964 trip, 63, I think 63. And he said, Malcolm told him this. And Kwame Ture was a friend of mine, and I kept forgetting to tell him this. Because remember, Kwame's on a march, James Meredith march, and Willie Ricks is whispering in his ear. He said, his name was Stokely then, say Black Power, stay Black Power. Kwame told me, he said, I thought Willie was kind of crazy. I don't know if I should say that, but he said Black Power. Willie had heard it from Adam Clayton Powell at a conference at Howard University. Well, guess what? When Malcolm met Paolo in Africa, Malcolm told him he and Adam Clayton Powell were preparing and planning a Black Power conference. Now we know that Malcolm's thought was clearly seminal in any kind of shift of the movement to Black nationalism or Black power. We also know that if the two of them were planning it, we know where the idea came from, Malcolm. So Black power, if you had Malcolm on the scene, you might have had a better definition of it because it's a good slogan, but translating it into power was another thing. So losing Malcolm was a serious thing, but I also think this, we're now in an era where we don't need singular leadership. That era is gone. We need collective leadership. One of the things I like about this Black Lives Matter movement is they pulled out of the Ella Baker playbook and see you need multiple leaders.
Right.
Especially when communities are fractured. So the strong leaders, usually the rule is when you have strong leaders, you may have weak movements. But when a community is fractured, there's no single person that can really pull it together. The problems are too complex. So, but Malcolm's playbook became really the playbook for Black nationalism to follow. The building of a Black United Front. You know what I mean? That was Malcolm's playbook. Internationalizing the struggle, the African Liberation Support Committees that follow, and providing support for African liberation movements. That also was at least a continuation of his thought. So what I'd say is, this has been one hell of a discussion, brother. And what I'd say is, people should check out brother Zak Kondo.
Yeah, it's been revised, right? It's been revised right now. Probably, okay. I'm hoping to have it ready in April.
Well, I mean, it's amazing that you would see a need to revise it, but I'm sure you come up with some new stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but yeah, we strengthening it, here and there. But no, I appreciate that.
The other thing I'd say is this: people should appreciate this. When did your book come out? What year was it?
1993.
1993. It took a lot of courage for him to write this book, because when you're saying the kind of things that he said right here, you could lose your life for it. It took some guts. You know what I mean? And some of us may not want to hear this because it's not pretty. This is the truth. And you should know the truth. The truth will set you free. We all have strengths and weaknesses. So as Amilcar Cabral, who's the guy in the back there with the sunglasses on, as he said, the greatest enemy of a people are their own weaknesses. So we need to work on them. But one thing we can say is El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, better known as Malcolm X, Big Red, was one bad brother. Bad brother. You hear me? And if Brother Zak wanted to be like Malcolm, that's pretty good. I know I did. In fact, my first draft on the political legacy of Malcolm X, Jacob Carruthers read it, and I knew it wasn't ready for publication after he read it. I can't tell where Malcolm ends and you begin. Because I was so caught up in identifying with Malcolm. You know what I mean? But you can understand it. It was a heck of a shadow that he cast on the planet. Bad Malcolm. And there's a whole lot of bad Malcolms and sisters who are coming up now, who have got some messages, and they're taking it to another level. So this may not have been pretty, it's the truth, but in the end, we got our shining prince. And I would like to agree with one other point you made. If you can avoid martyrdom, avoid it.
Yeah.
It's great to be able to talk about great heroes. It's even greater when they can live a long life and be buried when they're 90, or when they bury their enemies. That's even better.
Right, that's even better.
But when we lose one like that, learn everything you can from them. And I think that, I was in Cuba in 83 and 84 representing the National Black United Front, and we were negotiating agreements with them. Reverend Herbert Daughtry was chair, I was vice chair, and the head of the Americas section said, "Did you squeeze the orange?" We were trying to get everything we could from the Cubans. And I hope we squeeze the orange in this discussion right here. And brother, I'm really proud of you. And Black folks and anyone that watches this, you need to check this brother out. And he'll come up with a revised version of Conspiracy, Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X. And look for it when it comes out, and we will definitely push it.
I
Brother,
appreciate that. One other thing, Baba, and I would love for you to do a blurb. I have a book that's going to be going to press in about a month that is called Trump through Black Eyes, and I would love to for you to look at it and hopefully do a blurb for it. African World Press, no, excuse me, African World Books out of Baltimore, Baba Nati is gonna be publishing and stuff. But yeah, I would love for you to be one of the blurbers or whatever they call it.
Honor, brother. Big honor.
Okay, okay, so I'll be in touch with that then.
Okay. Anything you want to say in conclusion?
No, I think that each year it just gets longer. I mean, I still remember being a pretty young whippersnapper when I first started studying the assassination, and I'm just glad that I'm not sure we could have predicted when Malcolm was killed in 1965. Think about where everything was with him. I like the fact that we came over time to appreciate, because sometimes, great people are not always appreciated, certainly during their lifetime. But I think the good thing that I like about where we are as far as African people are concerned is that through hindsight and through other things, we have been able to grow. And I like the way that we've grown around Malcolm's legacy. Because think about it, when Malcolm died, there were people who didn't really appreciate what he brought to the table. But I think today, that's changed. And I think that's a tribute, to our people, that we're taking care of immortal ancestors. And that's important, for, we as African people, we need to be able to appreciate our immortal ancestors like a Garvey, like a Malcolm, like a Queen Mother Moore. And I love stuff like that about us as African people.
Right on. And they got plenty of Malcolms and Sister Ella Bakers coming and who are here.
Yeah.
I'm proud of this generation right here, right now.
Yeah.
They put Trump out of the White House and he's getting ready for the jailhouse. And he can try and run again if there's anything left of his money and his freedom. But if we do what we already did, that'll be his last shot. So, and I take my hats off to Black Lives Matter, the networks, the people in Georgia who put together all those voting registration networks.
Right.
And not only put Trump out of the White House, but also barely got the Senate back. Without them, that wouldn't have happened. So that spirit's alive. And it means that the younger generation has learned something from our generation and generations before. And that's really good.
Yeah.
So I really want to thank you, brother.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and just keep doing what you're doing and keep being who you're being, Baba, who you are.
Same with you, brother. And
I
don't even have to encourage you. I know you will.
And
but
likewise.
I do encourage it.
Yeah, and I appreciate it too, Baba, and I appreciate you.
Yeah, same here. In fact, the revolutionaries are rare among us, and we have to value them. And Malcolm is one, and I know you're one.
I appreciate it. And you as well. So, take care, Baba.
Okay, thank you.
All right then.
Hey, and don't work too hard tomorrow.
I wish, but it's all good though, Baba. It's all good.
Okay.
All right, now take care.